Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Saturdays Are for the Byzantine podcast. I am Professor Wren. I am your host. Again, Professor Wren, obviously a pseudonym, not my real name. I'm not really a professor, not employed by any sort of university. Just simply, I treat this podcast series as if it were, a lecture series, because really the only place you would get a lot of this information would be in the college classroom. And I kind of treat it as if I'm teaching a class in this, kind of lecturing about these topics. And so if I were teaching this class in a university, I would be called professor. So that's that. And if you don't like it, well, too bad. It's my podcast. This is my second time actually recording this lecture because last time I recorded it, I'm trying to bring you all some visuals, especially because in this, we're going to be talking about the age of migration, the migratory period. People call this time in history various things, the barbarian invasions. But I felt that for this topic, it would be good to have like some maps and things like that, because I understand that maybe not all the time people understand what I'm talking about, what it looks like, or where things are occurring. So, however, unfortunately, what I attempted to do was I attempted to narrate a PowerPoint and then on top of that, record this in GarageBand. And what ended up happening was I hit record in GarageBand and then I hit record in the PowerPoint. And when I hit record in the PowerPoint, it ended the recording in GarageBand. And then for some reason, when I converted the PowerPoint to an MP4 file, it could not be uploaded to, it just said that the file could not be uploaded to YouTube for whatever, even though YouTube is compatible with MP4 files. Either way, one way or another, it can't get on YouTube. I can't get it on, I can't put it on Podbean and then distribute it to the other podcast platforms. So we'll just talk about it again. It's okay though. It's okay. This is some great stuff. This is fantastic stuff to talk about. I do enjoy, this is apart from like medieval history, this is some of my favorite stuff to talk about, is late antique history. If I were to do a PhD, my first, the ones that I have applied for, are in medieval history. But secondarily, if for one reason or another that didn't work out, I would certainly be content with doing research in late antique history. I think it's really fascinating. But if you've found this video on YouTube, please make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. If you are listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Google Play, make sure to follow us there. And if you're listening on iTunes, give us a 5-star review. Only 5-star reviews are allowed. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the topic for this podcast is going to be, or this podcast episode will be the migratory period. So we're talking about the various barbarian tribes as they begin to migrate or invade into the Roman Empire. And I understand that we talked about the Goths before, but I want to take a step back for a minute and kind of address sort of what was this migration and why did it happen. This episode will be primarily why did this migratory period occur. And then in ensuing episodes, we'll talk about the effects of it. So we will address the Vandals, the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths. So we've already met the Goths and we've already talked about them. We're going to look at those two groups a little more closely. And then we'll also look at the Huns. And this episode is going to be very Hun-focused, but it's going to be Huns before they've entered the Roman Empire. Because I might have mentioned this in a previous episode. I think it's worth repeating. I think the Huns could have easily caused the fall of the Roman Empire without ever actually invading the Roman Empire. Because the number of, as we'll see, the number of barbarian tribes that they push into Roman territory, that they uproot from their traditional homelands, and then they flee as refugees, and they start entering Roman territory and raiding and establishing their own kingdoms. Eventually, that's a ways down the road, but it'll happen. That's all the Huns really needed to do to cause the fall of the Roman Empire. They never needed to enter Roman territory. And when they did enter Roman territory, the most notable battle that they fought, the Battle of Charlone, they lost. And then Attila did not attack Rome. He was dissuaded by Pope Leo to not attack Rome. He turned around. So the Huns, while they're in the Roman Empire, although they do cause damage for sure, they're not causing the same level of damage. I mean, the Goths sack Rome twice, the Visigoths in 410 and then the Ostrogoths in 476. And then the Vandals as well sack Rome in, I believe it's 455. The Huns don't sack the city of Rome at all. So, but either way, obviously they have a huge impact on the whole situation. So first we have to talk about who are the Huns and where do they come from. Well, there's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of things we don't know. So, but what we do know about the Huns, they came from Central Asia. They were Central Asian nomads. And in the late 300s, the late 4th century, they begin to come in contact with what you might call the European theater, the Roman theater. Well, what does them being Central Asian nomads tell us about them? Well, life on the Eurasian steppe, and that just means the steppe, the sort of the Great Plains of Europe and Asia, right? This is a lot of European Russia, and then a lot of Central Asia, what would today still be Russia, but also Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Mongolia as well, parts of China. Life there was very, very difficult. Okay, there's not a lot of settled agriculture in Central Asia because or really anywhere in the Eurasian steppe, not just Central Asia. The land is very infertile. There is not a lot of rain, so it's bad for farming. And then as well, there's not a lot of vegetation for large animals to herd. So cows do not do well on the Eurasian steppe because there's not a lot of vegetation for them to eat. They're a big animal. They need to eat a lot. What you can do on the Eurasian steppe is you can herd basically sheep, either way, sheep and goats. Goats can survive basically anywhere and on eating anything, and sheep can survive. They need a little more than goats, but they can still hold their own in pretty harsh conditions. So a lot of the Eurasian nomads, not just the Huns, are pastoral people. They are herding sheep and goats, and they spend a lot of time on horseback, because the other thing is that the Eurasian steppe is a big place, and it takes a long time to get anywhere. And so you don't want to be walking places. You definitely want to be riding a horse, because otherwise you are never going to get anywhere. Typically, when we say nomad, I want to kind of establish this about nomad. Nomad doesn't mean they're wandering around the place. They're not just kind of like wandering through the Eurasian steppe and saying, I guess we'll settle here for a while. I saw a bunny and it was cute. Let's stop here. No, that's not. This is not how these things work, right? Typically, what these nomadic groups would do is they would go to a northern pasture in the summer, because it tended to get more rain. Southern pastures would not get as much rain during the summer. And so less rain means less vegetation. And so they go to the northern pastures to graze their herds in the summer. And then when the snow comes down in the north and covers the ground in the winter, it doesn't snow in the summer. But during the summer months, they would go down south to the southern pastures, where there'd be more vegetation, basically. And they would kind of rotate through that, kind of spending half the year in one area and then half the year in another area. And then perhaps, if the vegetation kind of starts to fail, if perhaps one area is not getting as much rain as another year, if there's a bad flood or a bad fire, groups might move on. Obviously, you have to find better pastures. And then as well, perhaps certain groups are pushed out of their traditional grazing territory for their herds, or perhaps they find better territory and they kick out the people who previously were there, right? There's a lot of different possibilities for why people move around the steppe. Now, these people, the steppe nomads, did not. They primarily did live off the food that they got from sheep and goats, but it's not entirely. They would sometimes trade and, what was more often the case, extorted settled people who they were encounter kind of on the fringes of their territory to supplement their diets with food supplies, things like grain and other farmed products. So I guess the way you can imagine this is like getting held up at the farmer's market. Like the Hunnic warrior points an arrow between your eyes if you don't give him your bushel of wheat or something like that. Can you imagine seeing that on the news? Like, oh, this farmer today was held up at the farmer's market. Like, I don't know. It sounds pretty funny. Another, and part of that as well is as these nomads start encountering more and more settled people, you start hearing stories about like real civilizations. These settled people are kind of going to be on the outskirts of the big civilizations like the Persians and the Romans. But as you start hearing rumors and stories about how nice it is in a place like Persia, how in the Roman Empire they have so much money, it's such a lap of luxury, and a lot of these nomads who are already raiding is already basically in their blood, they hear that and they think, okay, I could get used to that. We could definitely go check that out. Now the Huns arrive again after crossing the Eurasian steppe. Now, no one knows exactly where in the Eurasian steppe they came from, right? The Eurasian steppe is a big, big place. In the book here, the good old book, Peter Heather, still don't know how to say the name, his Fall of the Roman Empire, A New History of Roman Barbarians, I believe he said something like the Eurasian steppe is about 5,500 kilometers wide from like its western edge in Russia all the way out to like Mongolia and China. So it's a massive place. And the other issue is that the Huns leave behind no written language. So they can't, there's no chronicles telling us, how they got from wherever they started to ending up right next door to the Roman Empire. Now, some people do theorize that they were the descendants of a group called the Zhongyu, which was a nomadic raiding group which raided China from the north from about 300 BC up until around the turn from BC to AD. And they may have caused the Chinese to build the Great Wall of China to stop the constant raiding which they were experiencing. Now, the Zhongyu were expelled from the Chinese area. Seemingly, the Chinese emperor, whatever, paid a nomadic group or possibly a combination of nomadic groups to go all attack the Zhongyu and just really kick them out of the place. And that happened somewhere around 9 AD. Now, a counter argument for why. So basically, what people would say is that the Huns were the descendants of the Zhongyu. They got kicked out of China and they went on this absolute screed through Central Asia and just, then they blew through the Eurasian steppe and they end up on the Romans' doorsteps. Well, a counter argument to that would possibly be that it does not take 400 years to cross the Eurasian steppe. Big as it is, it would not have taken them 400 years to get from China to basically the banks of the Danube River, right? But this assumes that they would have taken a straight path. Just they would have, okay, they lose the battle near China, and they just say, okay, we're just gonna steamroll through everything in front of us, and we're just not going to stop. I mean, to me that seems unlikely. If the movement across the Eurasian steppe probably would have been more gradual. Right, so they probably would have been in one area for a while where the pastures were good, and they kind of could, there were some weak peoples around them who they could raid and bully and all this, and maybe later on they kind of found better pastures and moved further west, and perhaps then a more powerful group came from behind them and kicked them out of their those pastures and moved them further west again. Right, this is not necessarily something where the Zhongyu would have taken a straight path across. And it may also be the case as well that the Huns were just a part of the Zhongyu. The Zhongyu. I think I've been missaying that. It's Zhongyu, not Zhongyu. But it's possible because these nomadic tribes are not necessarily always, or really hardly ever, one united group. A lot of times it's like a collection of clans. It's a confederation of people who kind of just go along together for various reasons. It's not random. But there possibility also exists. The Huns were just one portion of the Zhongyu group, and they split off, and then they started going further west. Another thing we don't know about the Huns is we don't even know what kind of ethnicity they were or what sort of language they spoke. Again, there's no written record that they leave behind. Hunnic was a entirely spoken language. No writing is available. So that means we don't even know what language family the Huns spoke. It was probably not Iranian. There were Iranian-speaking people on the steppe before. The ones that were the Huns actually fought and subjugated initially were the Sarmatians. The Sarmatians had dominated kind of the western Eurasian steppe for quite a while and had overthrown the Scythians, who were another Iranian-speaking people who dominated the western part of the Eurasian steppe before the Sarmatians. I'd say it's most likely, although we still don't know for sure. The Huns, I would say, most likely spoke a Turkic language, but that's just the most. It's the most likely answer. It's not. I can't say that with any degree of absolute certainty, because even Hunnic names that we have appear to be more Germanic, which would make sense, because if we don't have a written source for the Huns, but we do have a written source from the Goths, right? The Goths are Germanic people; they speak a Germanic language, and so when they're recording about the Huns who run them out of their ancestral homeland, they are probably going to write about the Huns using more Germanic forms of the names, which the Goths are encountering. Right, kind of like how there are various names when people would come to America or other new countries. One example that comes to mind is Nicholas Copernicus was the astronomer, and although his name sounds Italian, he was actually Polish, and his real last name was something like Copernici or something along those lines. And he had to change his name to sound more Italian so that he would be taken seriously by other Italian scientists at the time, because I guess even back then you had the trope of the dumb Polak. Which I will say, I am ethnically Polish myself, and Polish people fall on two ends of the spectrum. We are either incredibly intelligent or incredibly stupid. there's not a whole lot of middle ground with polls. There's not a whole lot of like, oh, that person, they're averagely smart, they're okay. No, it's either that person is brilliant or that person is a brick. But anyway, I was curious about this one aspect regarding the Huns, connecting them to the Zhongyu, and so I looked up if people had done DNA tests, because I figured if you could take a DNA sample from Hunnic bones that are left over, you could probably trace where they're from. The bits that I read about it the DNA tests seem to suggest that there's a link between the Huns and the Zhongyu. So again, that would be the most likely answer, but can anyone say this with any degree of certainty? No. Now the Huns, in their first encounter with some of the players in the theater, which we discuss here, some of their first encounters would have been with a group of barbarians called the Alans, and then, as we mentioned earlier, another group called the Sarmatians. Now, both the Alans and Sarmatians were Iranian-speaking peoples. They were both kind of, I guess you could say, nomadic. Fought primarily on horseback, lived on the steppe. The interesting thing, though, with the Sarmatians is that although the Sarmatians were they primarily fought with cavalry, lived on the open plains, they fought as more melee cavalry, more of a sword and lancer type cavalry, not as much horse archers. And the interesting thing about this is that, as I mentioned earlier, the Sarmatians overtook the Scythians. Now the Scythians were a primarily horse archer type armies. They primarily had horse archer based armies. And so one might ask the question, how is it that the Sarmatians could beat the Scythians, again, using their more melee cavalry against horse archer cavalry? I guess that's a bit redundant, horse archer cavalry against the Scythian horse archers, but then they lose to the Huns, and the Huns are primarily fighting with horse archers as well. And really, the answer to this question is that the Hunnic bows, Heather talks about this in his book as well, is that the Scythian bows were much shorter, which means that they didn't generate as much power. The Hunnic bows were a bit longer, estimated about, could get up to 130 centimeters in length. The Scythian bows would have been about 80 centimeters in length. Now, to kind of give you some perspective on this, if you were to go bow hunting for just deer, whitetail deer, I believe the requirements in a lot of states are that your bow has to have at minimum 45 pounds draw weight, which basically means, to pull the bow back, and when it fires, it's the arrow is shot out with 45 pounds of force behind it. And that will, with a properly placed shot, shoot through the body of a deer. The arrow will exit out through the deer's body and stick in the ground, basically. And I was trying to look up what the draw weight of Hunnic bow is, and it seems to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 85 pounds draw weight. So you're talking double the power that you need at minimum to shoot through a deer's body. And so this is these bows are shooting with a whole lot of power. I actually looked up some videos and kind of trying to understand this, and so I could kind of tell you guys about it. There's this one guy who did a demonstration. It seemed like some sort of old Russian dude who was just a very good archer with these. They called him a recurve bow. The other thing about the Hunnic bow is not a long bow. It didn't have like a straight arc shape. It had two kind of arcs, but then it would curl up forward. So it's not. It's hard to describe if you're not looking at it. I'd say just look up like Hunnic recurve bow, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But in this demonstration, this guy took, and it wasn't synthetic either. It was made out of real, natural materials. Takes a Hunnic bow, which he has recreated, and shoots it through a piece of plate metal armor, and then also shoots it at a riot shield. And it was the riot shield was kind of two layered, and it shoots through the first layer of the riot shield, but it doesn't penetrate the second layer of the riot shield. But still, that can kind of demonstrate for us that the Huns were able to take down a lot of armored opponents because their bows could shoot through a lot of armor. Especially if you're coming out with only leather, you're in really bad shape. My assumption is this could probably shoot through chainmail. But that is part of the superiority of the Huns on the battlefield, on top of their mobility, and then as well they could get fairly close to an opponent, shoot at them, and then either they shoot with their bows and arrows at an opponent so much that a line of infantry starts to break down and become disorganized, at which point you can then charge in with your cavalry, because if you are the type of person who plays like Total War, for example, parts of Total War which are not like real life, cavalry will not charge braced shield wall infantry. So the Huns, could not just take their cavalry and charge right into a braced line of spearmen. However, cavalry will charge in to a disorganized and disrupted line of infantry. Obviously, the horse is not going to run itself basically onto its death, right? Because running headlong into braced infantry is certain death. But another tactic the Huns might use is they would shoot their opponent for a while, wait for them to get really agitated, start to run away, and then the opponent would chase them. And then at some point when you have a group of enemy soldiers that are too far away from the main body of the army, then you turn around and then you hit them. And especially as they're running towards you, they're not in a braced, organized line, and so it's much easier for cavalry to take them down at that point. Now, by the time the Huns are fighting the Romans, a much smaller percentage, in all likelihood, of the Hunnic army would have been made up of Huns themselves, because as the Huns are going along and they're subjugating groups like the Alans and the Sarmatians and the Goths, right, and keep in mind, just subjugating does not mean you necessarily take over the whole group, because again, these tribes, they're not all one unified group. Sometimes, the Huns might subjugate some of them, kill another bunch of them, and then another bunch of them just get away and they run away, which happens with the Alans. The Alans are going to flee west and form a confederation with the Vandals and the Suebi. But by the time the Huns and the Romans are fighting again, the amount of Hunnic troops in those armies are probably much smaller, because the Huns are fighting with conquered Alans, with conquered Vandals, with conquered Goths. And that's where another thing is the Huns get good at siege warfare, and you're not good at siege warfare if you're only cavalry type army. You can't take a fortress just with mounted troops. You need infantry. You also need guys who are good in terms of siege warfare. We'll talk more about how the Huns seem to get better at sieging later on. So we've previously talked about how the Huns pushed the Goths from what was like modern Ukraine down south towards the Danube, and that's around 375. And this is the first domino to fall in the chain of events that'll lead to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Again, don't forget, the Eastern Roman Empire will survive until 1453. So almost 1,000 years from the fall of Western Rome in 476 up to 1453, when the Eastern Romans fall, or what we would call the Byzantines. Now, between 375 376 and the time we see other groups of barbarians start moving, that seems to be around somewhere between 405 and 408. So there are two coinciding movements of barbarians outside of the Roman Empire, which seem to line up to put tribes in the right places for the right movements. And so I'll explain what I mean by that. So in what is now Hungary, so north of the Roman province of Pannonia, so basically north of the Danube River, on the northern side of the river, you have the Vandals, and as well as the Suebi, who had been living in this area for quite a while. Heather says that it's at least 100 years that the Vandals have been living north of the Roman province of Pannonia, just on the other side of the Danube River. And in this period of the early the 400 early 400s, they all of a sudden start to move westward. The Vandals, the Alans, and the Suebi. Now, the Alans are moving from further east, but regardless. Because eventually the Vandals are going to move so far west, they're going to hit the Rhine River and cross the Rhine River into the Western Roman Empire there. Well, at the same time period, the Huns are moving west as well, and they take over the Hungarian plain, and this is where the Hunnic Empire is going to set up its capital. And this is right around in the same time period, between 405 and 408. So it has the Huns moving west and occupying a new territory, and right around the same time, the Vandals, Suebi, and Alans are moving westward as well, and they're going to hit the Rhine River. I believe it's in 409 that they're going to cross. They're going to cross it it's like New Year's Eve, 409. Basically, the river freezes over. I might be getting the year wrong, but the story is that these groups were kind of camped out on their side of the Rhine River, on the opposite side to the Romans, and they're like waiting to try to get a treaty to come over or do something, because they're essentially refugees. And what happens is that on New Year's Eve, the river freezes over to the point where all of these people can walk across it, basically. Now, there are some other arguments, some other historical theories about why this migration happens, why all these groups all of a sudden begin to invade the Roman Empire, explanations that are not Hun related. One of them is indeed climate change, this idea that in Northern Europe, in the late 4th century and early 5th century, there was a real cooling in there. Temperatures dropped, and farming conditions became worse. And so because of that, people didn't have enough food, and so they started to migrate south and west, I guess. Now, there does seem to be some evidence that during the 5th century, there was somewhat of a cooling that went on in the world. However, in the early 5th century, between 410 and 400, 410, 420, this had not started to take effect. And in fact, Heather addresses this idea in his book, and he says that, let's see here. This is from page 202. One source, written over 100 years later, records that it was a food shortage that drove the Vandals out of Central Europe, but this is unconvincing. They had lived there for hundreds of years, and the period around AD 400 was one of Europe's most climactic optimum. One of European climactic optimum, with sunny, warm summers. So as we can see here, it is not necessarily the change in climate that is pushing the Vandals out of their home territory. Again, they had been living there for a long time. The weather was good. Growing conditions would have been good. There was no reason for them to leave because of that reason. And as well, I think back to the Goths, they're certainly well before this time period. And Ukraine, if you know anything about the history of the Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Russian Empire for literally centuries. Very good growing conditions in Ukraine. when Stalin pursued dekulakization, which was the eradication, basically, of successful peasant farmers in the Soviet Union, that all took place in Ukraine because that's where all the, or I shouldn't say all, but a lot of the farming that took place there. And so the Goths were living in an area that was very fertile and very good for farming. So it doesn't, and we know the reason why the Goths leave. It's not because of a changing climate. It's because the Huns came through and ran them out of the joint, right? So I'm not saying that I don't think that this is a factor in everything, but I don't think it's as big a factor as perhaps some people make it out to be. I do think that because, especially in the last 10 to 20 years or so, climate change has become a big activist talking, right? There's lots of climate activism going around. A lot of people are trying to take measures to help the environment, to reduce carbon footprints, so on and so forth. I think that perhaps has bled over into the historiography of this time period. Basically, people now are very concerned with the climate, so they kind of take their modern concern for the climate and sort of read it into the history. And again, I'm not saying that it doesn't play a factor. I just don't think it's the primary factor in all of this movement that we're talking about. Now, I'm going to talk about two more factors that I think contributed to the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, and it's sort of two sides of a similar coin. So on one hand, I would say the weakness of the Roman Empire and the appeal of its wealth definitely got some people interested in invading the Roman Empire. So this was obviously true with a group like the Huns, right? The Huns, for years, exacted hundreds of pounds of tribute in gold out of the Romans, and so they understood a couple things. They also would have probably known that they had lost disastrously the Battle of Adrianople. So the Huns understand that the Romans have a lot of money, and their military doesn't seem to be particularly strong. So that's a great situation for them as raiding bullies, essentially, to go in there, extort a bunch of money out of these people, and then after you've squeezed them for a bunch of cash, then you go in and invade and take more stuff from them. And they understand basically that their military is not quite up to the task of repelling these invasions. You think as well with the Saxons. The Saxons were hired essentially as mercenaries by the Romans to defend Britain because the empire did not have the resources to put their own soldiers in Britain. Well, the Saxons show up, realize there's no Roman army there, say, "Hey guys, why are we defending it for them? Let's just take it for ourselves, right? Why defend for the other guy when it can just be ours?" And this is certainly the case with the Vandals as well. The Vandals really understood that, especially in North Africa, there was a lot of chaos that was going on in the Roman Empire in North Africa and outside of it as well. And also understanding that there's not a lot of military presence there at the time, they blew through North Africa. We'll talk about that later. Sorry, my voice is getting a little hoarse here. A whole day of teaching and now doing this lecture, my voice is definitely going to be shot for the night. But we're almost done with it. And this is, like I said, I love talking about this stuff. This is great. At the same time, I think as well, for a number of these barbarian groups, the promise of protection from the Roman Empire also contributed to their movement into Rome. Obviously, the obvious example, which we've been talking about for a while here, are the Goths, right? The Goths are run out of their native homelands by the Huns. They are refugees. They need a safe place to live, a place where they can set up a new home. And what better place to do that than the Roman Empire, right? The Romans will give you some land. You can farm it. You'll be safe. You're away from the Huns. You'll get protection from the Roman army. Even a lot of your own people will be serving in the Roman army and even move up to very, very high places in Roman society. I think to, for example, Stilicho. I can't remember if I've brought Stilicho up in this series or not, but Stilicho was a half Vandal, half Roman man who rose up through the ranks of the Roman military to basically be the second in command. When Theodosius dies, he leaves Stilicho in charge of his younger son Honorius in the Western Empire. I think basically Theodosius essentially understands that Honorius is basically an idiot, and that Stilicho is a highly, highly competent guy. And were it not for Stilicho, the Western Empire probably would have fallen much, much sooner. Stilicho really holds the place together for quite a while, and Honorius was a fool. Honorius has him executed on suspicion that Stilicho was conspiring against him. There really seems to not be a lot of evidence about that other than just rumors. Stilicho served the empire admirably, and like I said, was really one of the few people who was holding the place together. And he was half barbarian. And now, had he been full-blooded Roman, I think he probably would have been made his way into the imperial purple somehow. But the Roman practices at the time, you had to be a full-blooded Roman in order to be the Roman emperor. So I do think for a number of barbarian groups that the promise of the Roman protection was a factor in them trying to get into the Roman Empire, as well as, again, the other side of that coin, perceived Roman weakness also being a factor in groups moving to invade the Roman Empire. But that'll be where we end the lecture for this week. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much. Really do appreciate it. Trying to grow this show, trying to just expand it to new platforms, grow the audience, meet new people through all this. So I would definitely encourage you, if you're a regular listener to the show, please share it on your social media, share it with your friends, share it with your family. The more people who hear about the show, listen to the show, the better, right? If you've made it this far in the video, please give it a like if you're listening on YouTube. As well, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another video. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify or Google Play, give us a follow there as well as a 5-star review. We are on Instagram. You can find us at the Instagram page name is academics_95, and academics is spelled ACADEMIX_95. And I'll post updates there when we have a new episode of the show or other, fun things that I find about medieval or Byzantine or ancient history. I'll post there as well. That's a good place to interact. If you're looking to ask me questions or something like that, the best place to do that is in the comment section of the YouTube video. And then as well, we now have a Twitter account. So the Twitter account's name is Professor_Ren. You can find us there, and you follow us on Twitter as well. I'll be doing a lot of the same stuff that I'm posting on Instagram. I'll be posting onto Twitter as well. But if Twitter is preferable to you over Instagram, give us a look there as well. So, like I said, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you all next time.